Okay, so it's now my pleasure to welcome on stage for the next panel called Constellation Michel Cotton, as well as Val Ravaglia and Bernardo Mosqueira. You're welcome to join us on the stage right now. And I mean, it was really interesting to see in the former presentation. Please welcome our speakers first. Let's give them a round of applause. Maybe before we start, it was really interesting to see the image Michel Quo was showing of the mirror dome when it's uplifted in the air, where it's a round sphere and it literally does look like a star, you know, and in a way, what is interesting is that it is not only it has this reflective aspect that, you know, it does create a sort of distortion, a sort of light. You can see yourself. It does shift perceptions, but it's also in a way a bubble. We've talked a lot about how E.A.T has created itself as a network, but it's also been creating those kind of mini bubbles where experimentation was safe to create. And in this panel, actually, we're going to keep going with those, you know, stars, little bubbles, little places that were adjacent to E.A.T, that were happening at the same time, that could be as distant from one another as two stars could be, and yet where a constellation could start to occur. So for this, the protagonists are really going to be those groups that are outside of E.A.T, but working in the same time frame with collaboration between artists and technology. In terms of time frame, we're going to keep the post-war and also follow the development of computing with three key moments, from the mainframe computing in the 60s to the microprocessing in the 70s and personal computing in the 80s, and we'll be able to contextualize that as well in its political context. And for that, we'll have the luck of having Michel Cotton with us, director of the Kunsthalle Wien, who made a very beautiful parallel between what we call second wave feminism and the development of that computation. We'll also be able to speak with international art curator at Tate, Val Ravaglia, about Electric Dreams, her beautiful exhibition, where it very much deals with all of that experiments between artist and technology before the internet occurred. And with Bernardo Mosqueira, who's artistic director of Solar, and between many other things, who will be able to talk to us about a very specific, the European cheers, you see, will be able to talk to us about a very specific, incredible artist, Luis Fernando Benedit, who was himself a great experimenter between those creating dispositives between art and technology. So we're going to start with Michel. Michel, to introduce you a bit more formally, you're the artistic director of the Kunsthalle Wien. You were previously head of artistic program and content at MUDAM, Luxembourg, from 2019 to 2024. You were also director of Bonner Kunstverein in Bonn from 2015 to 2019. You have published numerous catalogs, written many essays, and notably the one that we'll focus most on today, that is Radical Software, Woman, Art and Computing, 1960 to 1991, that was published 2 years ago. Please, a round of applause for Michel Cotton.
Thank you. Thank you, LUMA. Thank you, Getty Research Institute, and especially to Simone and Martin for the invitation. It's an honour and, frankly, a little bit unnerving to be in the room with so much expertise and scholarship today. And when I was invited, I'm definitely not an expert in E.A.T, so when I was invited, I was a little bit confused and then thankful that it was explained to me that I was here to talk about radical software. Yeah, an exhibition that I made a little over a year ago now in Luxembourg, and then I brought it to my new institution in Vienna. It featured 140 works by 50 artists from 14 countries. It was an all-female artist list, and all the artworks were made before the World Wide Web became publicly accessible. So pretty much the same time frame that Val had in her exhibition. In the early days, I was describing my research as being about, I said that I was making a proto-cyberfeminist exhibition. That was my 3-word description. But I had to drop that quite quickly. More about that later, maybe. And the list was made up with artists that work with computers as a tool, or work with the computer as a subject, and I also allowed myself the liberty of including many artists or several artists who worked in an inherently computational way. And in this last category, I'd count Hannah Darboven, Bia Davu, Shanna Horowitz, for instance. And there's about 10 years earlier in the UK, I'd made an exhibition called Xerography at First Sight in Colchester, which looked at the history of photocopying in art. My idea was to do something similar with the computer. So basically to look across a period of time, abandoning conventional art historical categories, to basically use a technology as a lens to look at art history. And this technology was the computer. So Radical Software started the book, and also the exhibition in Vienna started with a timeline. It covered the last 3 decades. The show covered the last 3 decades before the internet, beginning with the era of mainframe computing in the 1960s, continuing through microprocessing in the 1970s, and then to the first decade of personal computing in the 1980s. A period that coincides, as Martin said, exactly with the second wave of feminism, an era that popularized an albeit incomplete idea of gender equality. And so the exhibition in the book begins with this timeline, which plots the history of artistic experimentation that you find in the exhibition against the history of technology, starting in the 17th century, when there was the first use of the term computer to refer to a person performing mathematical computations. And it continues to plot the history of human computers, many of whom were also women. And by the time you get to the 1960s, you have the first artworks from the exhibition. And it was a largely analog exhibition about digital art. So there was a lot of early works that were made in collaboration with engineers in laboratories. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, they were largely staffed by men. But the exhibition also covered the first decade of personal computing. So for instance, artworks made on the first generations of Macintosh computers and Amiga computers, works by Samir Halaby, Barbara Hammer, Charlotte Johannesson, for example. But today I've chosen to focus on 3 examples of the spectacular misuse of the technology. Because what I discovered, which in this exhibition, in my research for this exhibition, which is also a little bit similar to what happened with the photocopier, is that the history of artistic experimentation with these machines is basically one of using them for purposes that the technology was not intended for. And so if the computer was supposed to be a machine that would help us rationalize our world, make it more efficient, more productive, and smart, then artists were co-opting it for wildly eccentric projects, often edged with skepticism and critique. So my first example is also a tribute to an artist that also passed away only 3 weeks ago on the 29th of October. A House of Dust is a computer-generated poem created by Alison Knowles with the assistance of composer James Tenney on a Siemens 4004 mainframe computer. It was made using the programming language Fortran 4. Tenney led a series of workshops on Fortran in 1967 that were hosted by Knowles and her husband Dick Higgins in their New York home for their friends, which included some pretty incredible people. For example, musicians Max Neuhaus, Steve Reich, and artist Namjoon Paik were in attendance. A House of Dust came out of one of these workshops. Knowles provided a text comprising 4 lists, each beginning with a house of, followed by a randomized sequence of materials, a site or a situation, a light source and a category of inhabitants. And they found that the machine could generate 400 stanzas before a repetition occurred. Oh, maybe I go back. So it was, they found that they could, in our exhibition, the poem was generated by in real time on a dot matrix printer, and but there were different manifestations, including this poem drop over the house by a helicopter in 1971. On the 7th of March 1975, Barbara T. Smith made it snow in the desert, throwing 3,000 unique computer-generated snowflakes from a window on the 21st floor of the Las Vegas Plaza Hotel in Las Vegas. Smith worked with Richard Rubinstein to program a PDP-10 computer to produce snowflakes with 3 to 8 points using just zeros and ones. And then she disguised herself in a wig and sunglasses and checked into the hotel and dropped the snowflakes. And the event was documented in a series of photographs and also by a local television company that broadcast it on evening news. And what I love about this story is the way that they planned this action so meticulously. And then she told me that I never thought of the problem of picking them up. Yeah. And then 7 years later, at the Berkeley Computer Systems store in California, Sonia Rappaport inaugurated her Shoefield project. The work uses the computer to record, process, and display data that the artist collected about shoes. It was accompanied by a participatory performance entitled A Shoe-In, and participants had their shoes photographed and were asked questions about their relationship to the shoes, how much they liked them, where they bought them, and so on. Their responses were recorded and entered into a computer, and each participant was assigned a shoe psyche charge from -2 to 2. And this was done via an electric field theory program, which was translated the data into numbers, and it's one of the first interactive artworks made on the personal computer. And in later iterations, participants were asked to surrender their shoes and complete a computer-based questionnaire. It's something that we worked with the estate to basically reenact in Luxembourg and Vienna. And just to conclude, I love this piece for the way that its playful, interactive character basically resonates with our own era of compulsive data harvesting and gamifying human-computer interaction in a way to procure data. Thank you.
Thank you. You did talk about that spectacular misuse of technology that creates like endless poetry, as we can see with Alison Knowles, which was like a very beautiful homage to this work. It's now my pleasure to welcome. I've already welcomed you, but to welcome you again, Val Ravaglia, who's curator at International Art at Tate Modern in London. Val has a special interest in transdisciplinary curatorial practice. You curated Electric Dreams, Art and Technology Before the Internet, that was at Tate in 2024 to 2025, and is opening at Turin in Torino very soon.
It's open already.
It's open. Which open already? Like at Tate Modern, you worked on several projects on the Turbine Hall, notably the commission by Superflex, and for the Namjoon Paik retrospective in 2019. And you are currently working on a Julio Loparc solo show that will open, this one, in the future in 2026. A big round of applause for Val Ravaglia, who's got 7 minutes.
7 minutes on an exhibition that was sprawling from every point of view. All right, yeah, so I'll just jump straight into it then. So Electric Dreams, whose subtitle I still haven't reconciled with, Art and Technology Before the Internet. We heard yesterday about the shuddering motion of artists thinking, oh, art and technology. But also before the internet is contentious because, of course, ARPANET and the concept of internet was existing the entire time, the entire period that the exhibition covers. But when I said we really should say before the web, I was told that that sounded very old hat. Made me feel old, but what can I do? So we ended up with a subtitle that isn't quite fitting, but such is life. And I conceived it as an exhibition looking at the evolution of mechanical and algorithmically generated art in a very expanded sense between the 1950s and up until the early 1990s, ending, before the widespread adoption of the internet in its World Wide Web format. Presenting a network of stories about artists that found inspiration in the methods and tools of technology and scientific thinking without wanting to limit it to high-tech gadgetry or just to scientific ways of thinking. The main focus, at least for me, was to show a variety of practices from across the world, sometimes developed in isolation from one another and sometimes in a very network manner with artists exhibiting together, getting to know each other in particular places or with the opportunity of exhibiting together. And there was an emphasis on the link between practices that are often discussed in terms of optical and kinetic art, although that is also art historically a contentious label, at least I consider it to be, and how this connects to the rise of early digital art, particularly through certain movements that recognize the algorithmic nature of the type of geometric abstraction that they were working on and how it could easily be continued, those experiments could easily be continued with the aid of computers. It showed collaborations and the necessity of collaborating with institutions and companies that held the keys to the tools that the artists needed to carry out their experiments, but also experiments that were more of a DIY nature, with artists being able to use commercially available, portable commercial technologies and kind of like void the warranty by unscrewing the backs and playing around with what they saw in front of them, a la Namjoon Paik. No, you said 2 clicks it goes backwards? No, the red button. Oh, the red button, all right, never mind. So the exhibition opened with a look at Japan and Atsuko Tanaka, but I don't have enough time to talk about the entirety of the exhibition. So I'll concentrate on the hubs, which were the group rooms that sort of held the glue of the narrative of the show together. And the first of this was a sort of parallel look at Signal's gallery and the artists exhibiting around this London-based gallery that only existed between 64 and 66, but had an oversized influence. In parallel with Zero as an international network and not just the Düsseldorf-based German collective. Had a number of such. Before I need to talk about how I also had a room on experiments in art and technology, of course, which was primarily a documentary section, of course. And my interest was particularly to look at the projects from experiments in art and technology that happened outside of the United States. So from the Pepsi Pavilion at Osaka 70, but also, by the way, I've learned a lot these days about the blue notch card that I had as one of the objects in the vitrine. And the connections with India, specifically Ahmedabad, via the National Institute of Design, oh gosh, and Japan, Tokyo, and Otsuko Tanaka, which again is a connection that happened via Osaka. But the exhibition also opened with this almost hallucinatory level of detail in the diagram that was in the first room of the exhibition. I've split it into two so you can read it a little bit better. It also doubled as a map of the show, so that's the reason why it starts from the bottom. And it only covers what's included in the exhibition. It was never meant to be, you know, a Fluxus-style map of everything that's ever happened in connection to art and technology. I'm at pains to say this out loud for those who didn't notice and say, but where is X? Oh, not in the diagram. Yes, one of the groups that I discussed and that was very important for the exhibition is the New Tendencies, which really was a hinge for the show. Sorry, going back. And a kind of transnational movement that brought together concrete art, geometric abstraction, kinetic art, but also took an early interest in the computer as a tool for art making, and had its de facto hub in Zagreb, so in a non-aligned country in what then was Yugoslavia, as a demonstration of another space that is often disregarded or only recently has been recovered by art historians as a really important moment. The sheer number of artists that were connected to Zagreb, exhibited in Zagreb, is staggering, and I am convinced that many of the notions that then became a sort of philosophical currency for the aesthetics of that time were exchanged, you know, while having lunch in Zagreb between these artists, meeting each other and talking at the conferences. An important part of the New Tendencies is the Italian Arte Programmata movement, which really had an oversized influence. They started talking about programming art by considering the idea of making mathematically generated patterns and applying them as ways of programming their work, or simple, even rudimentary motors applied to their sculptures as a way to creating loops. But also they were indebted to the Opera Aperta, or open work essay by Umberto Eco, which also became a sort of staple of the conversations around the New Tendencies at that time. And it's interesting that it was already transnational in its inception, because Almir Mavigné, this guy over here, a Brazilian artist who lived in Germany and visited the Venice Biennale in 1960, but then went on a trip to Croatia, met Matko Mestrovic, an art historian, and together they decided to organize a series of exhibitions that went on until 1973, although formally 78, I think it's the last event. And many of the Arte Programmata artists showed in Zagreb. And around 1965, the movement started having a moment of deep crisis, because they realized that they were mostly, they subscribed to kind of socialist politics, also in an expanded sense. And the commercial success that op art was having around the time of 1965 and the responsive eye at MoMA gave them a sort of crisis of confidence in the kind of formal experiments that they were doing, and they started talking to each other, thinking, what are we gonna do now to recover our radical revolutionary spirit? And they decided that maybe looking at using computers in art was going to be the way to do it. The exhibition also covers other shows that were happening around that time, in parallel with Tendencies 4 and 5, which were the computer focused exhibitions of the New Tendencies, like Cybernetic Serendipity in '69, but also, and I'm gonna skip, Arte Cibernetica, a touring show that included Argentinian artists, and Arteonica, which actually I think I skipped. This is a work by, yes, by Valdemar Cordeiro, who also organized an exhibition in 1971 in Brazil. And I'm out of time, so this is when I'm going to leave it. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Val. I mean, when you see the exhibition and you see that diagram that is almost scary because of the amount of references, I'm really impressed that you managed to boil it down into a presentation that was that short. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So it's now my pleasure to welcome again on stage Bernardo Mosqueira, who's a curator, writer, and researcher based in New York, founder and artistic director of Solar, which is based in Rio de Janeiro, and director of Premio Foco Art Rio. Between 2023 and 2025, he served as chief curator at the Institute for Studies on Latin American Art, ISLA, in New York. From 2021 to 2023, he was part of the curatorial team at the New Museum. And in 2025, he received the prestigious Wilczek Prize for Creative Promise in Curatorial Work. Bernardo is an extraordinary, prolific writer, curator, and here he's going to talk to us about one specific project that is about to start. Please welcome Bernardo. Is technology with us today?
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you all in the LUMA's team. You've been all really amazing, welcoming, and flexible and supportive. And I really appreciate that. It's funny when you were mentioning about constellation. When I think about constellation and these discussions we've had in these last couple of days, the first thing that comes to my mind is actually the space run and how they were disputing for the sky at that moment, and the very possibility of all of us becoming stardust with the nuclear situation at that time. And I think that this is very much connected to the situation that I think I'm going to describe here with Luis Fernando Benedit. I was very excited to bring these artists as an example for our discussion, because it's an artist who was working and researching from Buenos Aires, traveling around, but really thinking from that perspective and being part of a very special generation that I'm going to try to highlight a little bit, that was very conscious about being Latin American and not part of the global North at that time. So in relation to Cold War, etc. I was very happy to see yesterday when I saw the show downstairs, to see Marta Minuhin's work. She's such a genius. I feel that we are all very lucky to be alive at the same time as these artists. And just to watch her video yesterday, remember my Minophone. You know, I think that we have to celebrate that. We really have to remember Minophone. And she was part of the same group of artists that I'm just going to talk a little bit about this context of Buenos Aires. Argentina was, in this process of industrialization, urbanization. The cities were growing, and there was a lot of international investment coming, and a lot of desire to be part of a global world at that time. We also have to consider that Argentina received 8.5 million immigrants from Europe in less than 100 years, so it was generationally connected to this territory too. And then, with all the crazy politics of that time, some groups got together to create conditions for experimentation. One of them was Instituto de Tela, a very important organization, Portuguese organization. Marta Minuhin, Lucio Fontana, David Lamelas, they were all part of this group. There was a lot of money coming from international foundations like Ford Foundations or Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation, and this was really giving them a lot of resources to experiment. For example, they were creating conditions for exchanges between engineers and artists, not only in visual arts, but also in electronic music. The Rockefeller Foundation, for example, created this one of the most incredible studios for experimental and electronic music in Buenos Aires in 1958. So there's a lot of documentation on that if you're interested. And in that context, works like Menesunda, this is the facade of the Tela Institute at CAI Florida. Whoever knows Buenos Aires is going to recognize. Marta Minohin and Santo Tonin with Menesunda that we saw downstairs. Lamelas, looking at Stuart, that I know that he's seen that a lot. And the other group here, really, really important, that has been mentioned before tonight and previously, CAIC, Centro de Arte e Comunicação, a group of scholars from the social studies and architecture schools in the University of Buenos Aires, that with all the political situation with the military dictator, etc., they were kicked out of the university and then decided to create this space. Benedict was part of the group, but also Glusberg, this very contradictory and fascinating person who was a businessman and also a writer, an artist, who led CAIC from 1962 to his death in 2012. So it's a long time for being a director. And at that time, they were able to really, their major, I would say, their most important ambition was to connect the art scene from Buenos Aires with the rest of the world, to bring artists and artworks from other places to Buenos Aires, and to really bring art from Buenos Aires. They say Argentina, but it's really Buenos Aires, to the rest of the planet. And they were really good on building these kind of networks through different kinds of strategies. And they were obsessed with the idea of being updated. So they were traveling all the time, finding ways to bring these artists are there, and also to respond to things that were happening internationally. So, for example, when the first time the IBM machine was used to make artworks, in 6 months they were doing it too. When primary structures happened at the Jewish Museum in '66, in less than 1 year, they made primary structures too in the Jewish Art Center in Buenos Aires. So they were really trying to show themselves as really updated and connected. And it worked. We were talking about mirrors. This is the facade of the CAIC original building, which is gorgeous. I hope that I have time to show a little bit of a video for you. They created different strategies for these new newsletters that they would send all around for free. And here we have some documentation of their collaboration with engineers and businesses also. Benedict was trained, actually, I'm just going to jump that because I can see that time is short already. Benedict was trained as an architect. Before graduating, he was already working as a painter and involved in very experimental groups, doing a very experimental gestures, just like as Menesunda, but related to theater and electronic music very much. I'll show you a little bit. But already in 1967, he made his first work engaging with living beings, creating kind of environments for living beings. His interest there was really, he was kind of intertwining different research, both in the field of cybernetics, but also behavior studies, psychology, really trying to think about, in his case, trying to think about if freedom exists, what condition our choices, and how we can deprogram, how could we maybe deprogram ourselves and be more free. So he started to create this kind of habitats for animals to change the conditions of the lives of the animals and see how they react and try to learn from that. these are some images of this show that I curated at Isla while I was chief curator there, together with Laura Hackel and Olivia Casa, that focus specifically in this moment between 1967 and 72, when he was doing at the same time painting and these very experimental objects and installations, not one before the other, but at the same time as different outputs of the same research, responding to political situations at the time, but also trying to find ways to represent the connections between living beings and their environments, or different living beings. Here we have attempts to represent the sensation of fear or hunger, or the world itself as a big intertwinement of viscera. He was, I forgot to say that he was very interested in, that the CAIC, they were very inspired by E.A.T actually. Which is important for this conversation, but also very inspired by eating. In the case of Benedict, food was a major issue in his work, and violence, of course. Here, these three paintings, they were actually part of one of these environments, part of the very first installations before installations, in which they were using multimedia resources to tell stories. In this case, the story of Barba Azul at the Moderno Museum there. And at the same time, he was using his resources as an architect to create projects for these environments for animals, and writing the instructions to how to change the conditions, change the space, put food, not put food, and see what happens. These are some of these habitats for ants, for tropical fish, for snails. This one on the right. One is for observing a drop of water, the other one for observing how a plant drinks water and evaporates. And at the back of the show, we can see these the IBM print assisted graphic works, but also a reference to three of his most important works, and I'll conclude, I promise, which are Biotron, a very large installation that was shown at the Venice Biennial, in which he had a beehive that could, you can imagine how crazy it would be to do that nowadays, a beehive, and the bees could choose if they would go inside of the box and feed from artificial flowers, serving artificial nectar. And there's a computer that is controlling everything, controlling the lights, controlling how many bees are coming and going. And the bees could also choose to eat from the flowers at Giardini, at the garden outside. Maybe at that time there were flowers at the Giardini, I don't know. But what the document says that the bees actually prefer to eat from inside of the box. The other example is Phytotron, major installation, exhibited first in Buenos Aires, but later exhibited at the Modern Museum in 1972, between 72 and 73, in the projects. One of the very early projects, one of the first, I think, projects started in 1971, 70, right? And it's still ongoing. And it was shown at that time together with a very large labyrinth for white rats. The documentation from that moment is amazing. The letters that people would leave at the museum, considering themselves rats with a white light, etc. It's just gorgeous. Here we have Benedict. And the very last work, Labirinto Invisível, which is a labyrinth made with mirrors. At the center of the installation, there is a plexiglass aquarium with an axolotl. And there is only one way to reach the center without ringing the alarm. And then you can see people doing attempts to you can see people learning and conditioning their own movements through this work. I think it's very much influenced by Cortázar's. And we were able to reinstall this work here at Isla, which was really... and the only works, I swear, the only works that were beyond these time frames were the series of watercolors in which Benedict was imagining after the day after the animals start to disappear, etc. Would we be able to reconstruct them through engineering? So he made this whole series of works about the categories of natural and artificial, and I'll leave there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernardo. So I promise that it's not for the relationship to eating that we invited you to talk about the E.A.T. Really, it's more the connection with the way in which artists were, like such as these were operating with forms of collaborations that were very interesting in the kind of boundaries they were shifting. And actually, maybe I want to start with a question maybe about the use of cybernetics, and we could actually start with you, Bernardo. Like, there've been some connection to cybernetics in terms of work, like the idea of like seeing how like systems like machine, animals, or organization using feedback loop have a result that shifts in terms of what they do next. Do you think that might have had an influence on the kind of practice that we've seen right now in Benedict's work?
Yeah, 100%. In his case, of course, there is the actual use of cybernetics and technology to build these last works that I highlighted here. But in his case, the theoretical research around cybernetics influenced his work more than anything else. The idea of programming, the idea of binary structure, the ways of organizing ideas around binary charts, etc. These all became very influential in his own practice, and not only in his case, but in the history of critical theory in Latin America. Cybernetics became very influential for people who were not using technology in general. For example, two of the most interesting theories for me, writers in Latin America in the 20th century, like Umberto Maturana, he uses cybernetics 100%, but the work is about autopoiesis, is about life, is about knowledge, and he's not building machines exactly, but he's very much influenced by the field.
Mm-hmm. Val, I guess that I know the answer you're going to say. That's yes, but like how do you think that cybernetics was like instrumental, like technically implemented in specifically in the new tendencies that you were talking about in Zagreb?
I'd be interested in doing some research about the spread, how exactly it spread around the world as a concept. But it started in 47, 48 as a theoretical concept. And it remained in, it was the cybernetics as a concept was always, or as a discipline was always conceived to be transdisciplinary. Like the whole idea of having the field of cybernetics was so that experts in different disciplines could talk to one another about notions of feedback, homeostasis, and self-regulating systems in a way that could transmit or allow these experts to communicate between biology, information science, psychology, governance. In the first phase, though, it was kind of primarily an academic discipline, and every once in a while some theorist would discuss cybernetics, and he would permeate by osmosis into the cultural field. But it's particularly in its version in the 1960s, which is kind of like the second wave of cybernetics, with people who more explicitly framed it in terms of biology. So Maturana and Varela were absolutely fundamental for this step. That it became more of a reference point for visual artists as well. Until recently, I've noticed that it's changed not too long ago, but until recently, the English language Wikipedia page for cybernetics mentioned cybernetic serendipity as the moment of permeation of the concept into visual culture, although that's provably wrong because for example, the group de recherche
No,
d'art visuel.
I want to come back on that. So cybernetic serendipity, which is this famous exhibition at London ICA in 1968, that we're going to talk about actually just after. Like, so it's mentioned as the moment when an interaction between artists and cybernetics are.
As a kind of watershed moment, yes. But if you read the...
And why would that be wrong then?
Because there's a writing by Julio Leparc, I'm doing lots of readings around Julio Leparc, where he's complaining about it being like a buzzword that artists like to use in trying to contextualize their perceptual abstract works. And he's like, oh, but you know, artists can justify their works using cybernetics and such, but really it's about the space in between the artworks and the viewer, which is, again, a cybernetic concept just simplified for the masses. Yeah, so, and this would have been written in 63 or 64. Okay. Yeah, so, from the get-go, the New Tendencies, the writings of the New Tendencies included concepts of cybernetics, so that would have been from 61 onwards. Yeah, so, but I have not admittedly done like a systematic studies of the penetration of the term. If anyone's interested in writing that paper, just let me know.
The word is open. I mean, you mentioned that show, cybernetic serendipity, and actually I did wanted to ask a question about the very notion of serendipity. That is something that is, of course, going to be very important when you have artists working with engineers and, you know, who knows what can happen? Well, serendipity kind of plays a role, and I wanted to know, Michel, like, what could you tell us about that very notion in the context of that beautiful exhibition that you curated, Radical Software?
Yeah, well, the exhibition was in a way a kind of moment of serendipity, because I realized that a lot of the artists, and we managed to bring a lot of them together as much as possible, also for a symposium, and so many came for the exhibition in Luxembourg, which was already quite a surprise because hardly anyone ever comes to Luxembourg, but but they mostly pass through. They mostly pass through, and but yeah. So many of them came together for this for the opening in Luxembourg, that we brought them together purposefully for a symposium in Vienna, and I realized that actually they weren't very connected at the time. Like, artists that should have known each other hadn't previously met, or they knew they had friends in common, and yeah. So this was quite interesting, and I think also quite different from that Nouveau Tendencies movement, where they were very connected and they all kind of kept up with what each other was doing. But there's different levels of serendipity, I think, in that show. Like,
there's also the visual outcome. Some visual outcomes are a result of a form of serendipity.
Yeah, there's also, there's the notion of chance in computing. I mean, Barbara T. Smith's piece that I talked about is called Outside Chance. But then there was many instances, I think, of artists in my show who made works with the computer just because they met somebody who was a programmer who could, or they had access to a mainframe computer after hours in a laboratory where they knew someone was working. Vera Molnar was signing her prints. The prints had this job Molnar registration on them at the bottom of the print, but it wasn't actually her login she was using, it was her husband's. So there's all these instances of artists using computers in the early days, in the mid to late 1960s, when they were there using time on the mainframes, like after hours or at the weekends, when, you know, that valuable time on the computer that was there for scientific or military, like, kind of research was not being used by the engineers.
But that almost sounds like kind of like digital wandering or pre-digital wandering, which is a beautiful way of thinking of a way to use your free time, so to say. Do you have an example, Val, maybe of like an artwork that would be pure result of that kind of serendipity, but from the collaboration between artists and engineers?
With collaboration with engineers?
Or not, just like an example that you would like to.
The first example that comes to mind is how, for his first exhibition with televisions in Wuppertal, Namjoon Paik was delivered a television that wasn't working. And he just thought, okay, there was only visible a single horizontal line. So he flipped the TV on its side and it became Zen for TV. And that's one of his most iconic works. But also, and actually this serendipitously came up, you mentioning him as attending Alison Knowles' Fortran the workshops, and that's when he must have heard about Fortran, and then he asked Michael Knoll and an electronic musician that was Max Matthews, I think was his name, to give him access to Bell Labs so that he could use the computer and muck about with Fortran for a bit, and generated a couple of his Bell Labs experiments, including that video that has the single pixel that travels around the screen. So Namjoon Paik, who's kind of a maître of serendipities, he would use any opportunity with...
So serendipity leading to Zen, at least in this context. And
Yep.
And maybe like one of, I mean, slightly changing, like in terms of like another thing that is very important, of course, is like not the right use of technology, but at least like its kind of consequences. And Michel, like you draw a lot on the work that Beryl Corot established with this magazine, Radical Software, that was kind of studying a sort of media ecology of the televisions in the 80s. And there is this moment that is very interesting. I don't know if it's her quote you told me, but like it's in an editorial she wrote where she says, "Power is no longer measured in land, labor, or capital, but by access to information and means to disseminate it. Our species will survive neither by totally rejecting it nor unconditionally embracing technology, but, and that's the important part, by humanizing it." How does that resonate with her work?
So that's from 1970, which and she was. It wasn't so much television, but video they were interested in, and the kind of democratic potential of that technology. So meaning that television, for example, is like a broadcast medium where you are delivered information. It comes one way in one. It's a one-way thing. But they were interested in video as something where, like, potentially anyone could get access to a video camera. They could record what they wanted. There could be this like kind of, there would be this possibility to watch what you wanted when you wanted, which that was very different to the broadcast medium of television then. So, and Radical Software was that was in the editorial of the first issue, and this was their idea to basically empower people by giving them knowledge about technology and about how it worked, and and there's something very inspiring, I think, about all those artists learning Fortran and and teaching themselves programming and languages and so on. Because there's a kind of there's a sense that of access through access to this power, that this the potential that this holds.
Well, no, it resonates a lot with an argument that Michel you argue about E.A.T. as well, which that it was very much like it kind of represents like the erosion of a certain model of a very mass communication that is centralized and top down to trying to establish a sort of network, rather a network of technologies and people like nested together, and that of course like has major, and that's really your argument, like has major implication on revisiting this notion of the individual as like the autonomous subject, and try to see like a more entangled conceptions of collaborations. And so that will make a very beautiful transition to the panel that we will have next, that will be about decentralization, and as you can see, like there were lots of connection between those two. Again, I want to give you like a warm round of applause, and thank you so much for these collaborations.